Right.
But what this shows to me is that at the time when the Prime Minister kept on saying and talking about the science, and Matt Hancock kept talking about the science, which we were all following, it was very clear even then that there was no such thing as the science. There were different interpretations, and as Jonathan Van Tam's just said, very different personalities looking at the same science and thinking all sorts of different things about what it meant and what it should mean for all of us.
Well, and in a sense, quite rightly so. There is no such thing as a science, and many of us were actually making that argument at the time.
Yeah.
And ultimately, a lot of this was a political judgment. I think that the two big things that came out of the evidence today were, one, Chris Whitty's dismissal of the policy of so-called herd immunity. So what that essentially would have meant is just protecting the vulnerable, the very elderly and those with underlying health conditions, and allowing everybody else to crack on. Chris Whitty dismissed that policy as ridiculous. And the many scientists, very eminent and distinguished scientists and public policy, health policy experts and epidemiologists who suggested that at the time, were roundly smeared and condemned by the government because Chris Whitty and others didn't agree with it. So now we know for sure that was very much coming from Chris Whitty. That was not an option. They would still argue absolutely that it wasn't ridiculous, and the price that was paid by lockdowns was more than what would have been paid by allowing herd immunity to be followed. Chris Whitty argues that it would have meant the vulnerable were isolated for far too long. Well, in reality, the very vulnerable were isolated for the best part of 2 years. So I think that's very debatable. The other thing that came out of it, which was extraordinary, I thought, was Professor Sir John Van Tam's evidence about the horrendous attacks that he had on his family during the course of the pandemic, the threats, and they were horrific. You know, he taled about a credible threat for, he didn't say where those threats came from. It could be a range of people who were upset about the government's policy, but he talked about his family being advised by the police to leave their home in the middle of the night because so credible were the threats to their health and safety. And he talked about a threat that his family would have their throats slit. I mean, whatever you think of how the government handled this pandemic, whatever you think of his approach to the science or Chris Whitty's approach to science, these were people working on behalf of the nation to the best of their ability. We can disagree about the way they did it, but my God, they worked hard. And it was shocking to hear that they were subjected to that kind of thing. And, you know, give the guy his due. He never let on at the time, did he? They covered they hid that, they carried that on their shoulders.
Let's bring in Adam Schwarz. Adam, when you're listening, when you're looking, are you seeing much what Isabel is seeing, or are you seeing something that is playing out in a very different way as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think partly that is correct. I mean, I generally agree with Isabel. Of course, there's no such thing as the science, but of course, there is such a thing as the scientific consensus on certain issues. And I think I'm a little bit disappointed, of course, to hear that Isabel almost advocating for what was considered to be known as herd immunity, which was this idea that you could essentially let the virus pass through the population and hopefully try to isolate those most vulnerable, and those who are able to just get infected will be fine. But I think actually one of the things that Chris Whitty said quite clearly was that actually it's impossible to do that because of the different situations where you have in so many households with so many people of different generations living there. And especially to do that at such short notice in March 2020, when essentially the science on the virus was really not established, I think would have been a completely reckless thing, and would have led to, of course, the NHS being overwhelmed and even more people unnecessarily dying. So I certainly wouldn't agree with that, but I would completely agree with what Isabel said, in the sense that it is completely unacceptable for any public official, and certainly civil servants and advisors, to be intimidated in any way for simply doing their jobs. And I think that the way that Chris Whitty sort of handled himself in terms of his submissions today, which was done in quite a sort of restrained and guarded way, I think partly suggested the fact that he was quite aware of the fact that he was in a very difficult position, and actually he was criticized by people on both sides of the argument.
Isabel, you've spoken against lockdown often and frequently.
And I will continue to do so because the collateral damage is so extraordinary. I mean, we heard today NHS waiting list at 7.8 million. I mean, that is a direct consequence, as is the state of the economy, of lockdowns.
However, you're listening to Chris Whitty now, and yesterday on the programme I had Dr. Lawrence Buckman on the programme, and he said what it meant was locking people down meant that far fewer people got COVID. And because far fewer people got it, far fewer people died of it. And he
that's
said,
just not
and he's
demonstrably not the case. Look at Sweden. I mean, they've got they have less excess deaths now. So, you know, ultimately, the real life example of how this works out if you don't do repeated lockdowns is Sweden, and they have fared a lot better than we have.
He said that ultimately, what would you rather be? Would you rather be dead and have a more buoyant economy, dead and have a shorter NHS waiting list? You have to be alive, otherwise it doesn't matter what state the economy's in. And as a you know, practicing GP, he was chairman of the BMA, you know, somebody who does understand, in inverted commas, the science, that if you're in and not mixing with people, in the same way as we didn't get colds because we weren't near anyone, we didn't get upset tummies because no one was coughing on us or breathing on us, you know, we all suddenly felt if we didn't have COVID and we didn't die and we didn't get terribly ill and get long COVID, we felt better than we'd ever felt in our lives, maybe not mentally, but certainly physically, because we hadn't been near anyone else to give us some nasty bug.
And what a hideous price there was to pay for that brief feeling of being a bit better than you've ever felt before. Look at the collateral damage. It is astonishing. 140,000 children have never returned to school. What do you think those children are going to do? We have a lost generation as a result of this, an absolute epidemic of mental health disasters. We've got people waiting over a year for basic health treatment, for operations that they desperately need. The economy is on its knees. The price paid for lockdowns was phenomenal. We can argue until the cows come home whether it saved more lives then and cost more lives later. I will never, ever believe that it was the right thing to do once we knew that this virus only was likely to be fatal to the very elderly and vulnerable. I think the first lockdown was the right thing to do, by the way, but there was no justification for doing it again and again and again. And there were people in care homes who were isolated for the best part of 2 years, cut off from their friends and family. They had no reason to
respond to that. Adam, Isabel, you know, talks about this a great deal with passion and conviction. I know you're shaking your head. How do you respond to what she's just said?
Well, I think no one would argue that the lockdowns didn't come with considerable social and economic consequences, but I think that is not necessarily just directly linked to the fact that we had lockdowns, but in the fact that they were very poorly managed lockdowns by a very incompetent government that was proved over and over again. I think combined with the situation where you had deliberate and chronic underfunding of public services, which essentially meant that our public services that should have provided people this crucial support on issues of mental health and issues of education and the issues of health simply were not there because of years and years of chronic underfunding by the Conservative government. Now, I think personally, I was raised that you have to prioritize life as much as you possibly can. And we were in a situation where actually vaccines were being developed at the time. We didn't know that they would be as effective as they were, but we knew they were being developed. And so ultimately what we really had to do was to delay as many people getting the virus as possible to ensure that there would be a minimum impact on both health and death. And I'd also say that actually it's a complete, disingenuous statement that actually it's only the most ill people that COVID affects very negatively, because we know that it's not simply a case of dying from COVID, but actually it makes chronic conditions so much worse, combined with the fact that we have a very significant rate of long COVID and long COVID associated conditions, which will also have their own economic impacts for years and decades to come, of which we don't really know the full price. So unfortunately, the country and the world was in an impossible situation. And I think to simply simplify the situation as, oh, well, the impact of lockdowns was so negative that we shouldn't have done it, is really, kind of not representing actually the impact of what would have happened if we didn't lock down.